Hi, good morning to everyone at Chatham House and those of you joining us online around the world. And welcome to this discussion about how Asia's economies are responding to Donald Trump's tariffs and the broader shifts in the global geoeconomic order. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House. President Trump's return to the White House has blown new clouds of uncertainty over Asia's economies at an already difficult time for many. I think it's fair to say that protectionism was already on the rise around the world. Growing tensions between the US and China have cast doubt, I think, on the sustainability of Asia's economic model, which relied up to now on good relations with both Beijing and Washington. And we know that China's own economy has been facing its own increasing cyclical and structural challenges. Trump's initial reciprocal and many other tariffs hit Asia pretty hard. He's since delayed imposing many of the tariffs until July, and he's reached a temporary trade war ceasefire with China. But many Asian officials, I know from my travels to the region and other conversations, are still scratching their heads, like the rest of us, about what will come next. And with such a murky outlook, many private investors are sitting on their hands, thereby not delivering Trump or anyone else the boost that they want from some of these protectionist measures we've seen. So what can Asia do about Trump's economic policies? And how far will he upend the model that's brought peace, prosperity, and stability to a region that's the engine of global manufacturing and global growth? I'm joined by a great panel today to discuss this all. Down the line, we have Tunku Zafrul Abdul Aziz, who is Malaysia's Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry. He's been in office since 2022 and previously served as Finance Minister. Before politics, Minister Zafrul was a prominent banker and investor in Malaysia. And in addition to his government service, he's recently secured the far more important, at least from Malaysians' perspective, job of President of the Badminton Association of Malaysia. So yeah, good evening to you, Minister Zafrul, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Ben. Thank you for having me.
Joining me as well on stage, I'm lucky to have two top colleagues. Next to me is Yu Jie, who's our Senior Research Fellow for China. And next to Yu Jie is David Lubin, who's a Senior Research Fellow in our Global Economics and Finance program. Before we get going, a quick reminder that this event is on the record and it's being recorded and live streamed. I'll quiz our panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes and then open up to questions from our audience in person and online. If you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A box to ask your questions and do get them in now because I will feed them into the conversation as is relevant. So Minister Zafrul, I'm going to come to you first. Thanks again so much for joining us. I know you're busy traveling around the world. You're negotiating with the Trump administration. You've just been in Saudi Arabia. How difficult is the economic outlook at the moment from Malaysia's perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ben. Thank you again, and the rest of my fellow panelists. Yeah, you're right. Just came back from Riyadh, and before that, I was in the APEC meeting in Jeju in Korea for the minister responsible for trade. For Malaysia, we are very much an open economy. As you know, we look at our trade to GDP, it's about 180%. And obviously, the Liberation Day will impact Malaysia's GDP growth. For 2025, we are projected to grow in terms of GDP between 4.5 to 5.5%. That's before the announcement by Trump administration and by Trump on the reciprocal tariff. So now we are reviewing that. We're still waiting for more information. We're doing some sensitivity analysis. At the same time, as you said, Ben, I'm also leading the delegation in terms of negotiations with the Trump administration. So we're waiting for that. We have a 90-day pause for now. But definitely, if you ask the analysts, you can see that they have revised the projection for Malaysia's GDP by about 100 basis points. And for us, for the government, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance is reviewing our GDP forecast. And it's definitely going to be revised downwards given the uncertainties and the impact and the possible impact of the reciprocal tariffs.
What's your sense, just looking a bit more broadly, like where is this coming from? Do you think this broader shift towards protectionism is just about President Trump, or is there something deeper either in America or in kind of the world economy and our societies that's driving this broader shift?
Well, in your opening just now, Ben, you said this is not something new, and I somewhat agree with you. And you've seen that even during Trump 1.0. And if you look at global FDI, it has been declining since. But for ASEAN, it has bucked the trend, and ASEAN FDI has gone up. And why is that? I think one of the reason is companies have already started to realign their supply chain. When they redesign their supply chain according to the geopolitics, the geoeconomic circumstances that they face, right? So Malaysia and ASEAN, if you look at ASEAN centrality and ASEAN neutrality, it's in a good spot where companies can then realign their supply chain to the region. And we've seen the global FDI going down, but FDI into ASEAN going up. And you've heard about this China plus one, Taiwan plus one, everybody plus one, and somewhat with Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, of course, Singapore have all been net beneficiary of this. So you're right, it's not new, but whether it is here to stay, I think, well, your guess is as good as mine, Ben. But of course, Malaysia, like I mentioned to you before this meeting, I just called for ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting before this call, where I chaired 3 meetings, one with the Chinese counterpart, Minister of Commerce of China, and then after that, the Minister of Economic Trade and Industry of Japan, and then after that, Minister of Trade for both Australia and New Zealand. And all of us in that call, again, reiterated our position in supporting the rules-based rules-based multilateral trading system with WTO at its core.
Great. Well, I think we're going to come back to those questions about regionalism, about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a bit later. I want to turn to the other panelists now, and maybe get a perspective from you, Jeff, first on sort of China's sort of initial responses. We obviously saw this, I guess I called it a temporary ceasefire. Some people, I think Trump's called it a trade deal with China. Yep. How do you think China has managed the first kind of few months of Trump on the economic side? Mm-hmm. And, how does it feed into their broader thinking about, the next few years of economic relations with America?
Well, thank you, Ben. Delighted to be here and share the panelists with several other experts in here. Obviously, the 2 D words in here when it comes to trade war after Liberation Day, the one was détente, and then the other word is defiant. I think Beijing has chosen the latter, stay defiant. And obviously, what Beijing has learned from Donald Trump's first term, it is to offer that sense of maximum pressure to your opposition. So what Beijing has done is actually borrow the playbook from Donald Trump himself and give the maximum pressure from the United States, and in order to make Donald Trump and his fellows come to the negotiation table. Now, Donald Trump used the term trade negotiation. I think if you examine the public statement put forward by the Chinese, they're very carefully by saying, we're glad this talk has now begun taking place in Geneva, which happened 2 weeks ago. So China does not necessarily consider this is some kind of negotiation already to take place, but only consider as being an initial getting in touch and getting to know each other and who to speak with. So that is one thing. Now, I think secondly in here, Beijing is convicted that even if we're going to have a permanent ceasefire on trade front, so you use the term temporary ceasefire, and I would rather call this current period as a truce. And then even if we come up with a permanent ceasefire, and what we're going to have is we're going to have a very weak trade agreement between Beijing and Washington. And Beijing clearly knows that Donald Trump may not really honor such an agreement and may not keep the promises, as he's taking like the sense of unpredictability as a virtue, but not as a vice. So that is another element. So Beijing would believe that even if there's an agreement, so everything may not be agreed by Trump overnight. This leaves Beijing very little choice. So the choice is that in the past, the model has been run through the Chinese economy, largely led by export-oriented, high-end manufacturing to United States and Europe. And I think that model has already gradually shifting. And if I remember the data correctly, I think really by the end of 2022, ASEAN replaced the European Union as the largest trading partner with China. So I think really Beijing has learned from back to 2018 onward, try to diversify is the destination of exports and try to also diversify is source of purchasing on agricultural products, which is absolutely essential for the Chinese population, and also try to diversify is a source of purchasing on raw material that will fuel the Chinese economy. So that is more on the preparation end. Now, when it comes to the offensive end, I think what we have seen so far is that Beijing has now become more likely to use a very stringent export control on the critical minerals, which is something that Beijing knows it has the upper hand in this. So what I'm going to expecting and envisage is that Beijing will carefully examine the trade agreement between United States and a third country. And if they have discovered any elements that would actually harming China's interest, and I think Beijing will go after the third country at the same time, and particularly to make those companies doing business with China more difficult and have more stringent rare earth mineral control as well. So I think this is the short term. Now the longer term, obviously there has been large debate within China whether to offer stimulus and how far the stimulus will go. But I think overall, the target will be given to the lower to middle income groups and offer them extra consumption vouchers, offer them extra income helps to a large extent, because these are the core supporters of Xi Jinping. So many things that perhaps make economic sense in here, Xi Jinping is considered in the political terms. Now, so far, he felt optically, and he felt he now has the upper hand on the trade negotiation with Donald Trump and somehow at the domestic end. And he felt he has actually consolidated his power, both within the party, but also in the wider public. Yeah.
I think we might have to come back to that question later of whether China's really diversifying its exports, because I think when you look in the data, actually, a lot of the exports to Southeast Asia are intermediate goods and machinery that are then being used to manufacture products that are being exported ultimately to the US and Europe anyway. So if the real ambition of the Trump administration is to sort of break up the China manufacturing machine, then presumably you'd have to break up the linkages between China and other manufacturing centers as well. But we can come back to that later. So I want to turn to you, David, to get a kind of broader perspective when you're thinking and looking across the region. I mean, there was obviously this initial panic when Trump announced the very high reciprocal tariffs. Then there's been a sort of a kind of strange relief, almost too much relief, when there was just a pause on the tariffs. But how do you think governments in particular, we can get onto the markets maybe as well in a second, but how do you think governments in Asia have responded to this challenge? Do you think they've taken it seriously enough? Do you think they're just hoping it all somehow goes away after July? And do you think that's realistic?
I mean, governments, the corporate sector and financial markets each have kind of different responses to the period of uncertainty that we're now in. I think for governments and corporates, uncertainty creates paralysis. What can you do when the framework within which you're making policy decisions or investment decisions is so completely in the air? And of course, the minister and his counterparts are all in the process of kind of trying to minimize the damage. I suspect that damage will be minimizable, but not eliminatable, if you see what I mean. And I think that from a financial markets perspective, what slightly worries me is that the market has kind of taken the pause too much to heart. So, on the 9th of April, we had this kind of 90-day extension. In a way, from the 9th of April until last weekend's agreement, or the weekend before's agreement with Beijing and Geneva, we've seen this kind of extended period of Trump pulling back from the worst consequences of the announcements on the 2nd of April. What that's commonly referred to in financial markets as the Trump put. In other words, that there's a kind of floor under asset prices below which stock market prices and everything else is just too painful for Trump to tolerate, and so that floor is in place. I think it's worth considering that as well as a floor on asset prices, there is also a ceiling. In other words, there will be a long enough period of asset price stabilization and/or an increase in asset prices that is sufficient to give President Trump the sense that he's rebuilt sufficient amounts of political and financial capital that he can then spend that capital by reintroducing disruption. And so I think that we're in particularly with respect to financial markets, we're in a kind of phony war. This isn't a new equilibrium. It's just a period of calm before the reintroduction of volatility. And I think that that's true because the central objective of the reciprocal tariffs is to cut through what the minister described as realigning supply chains. What the minister describes as realigning supply chains is what Washington sees as tariff arbitrage. In other words, either goods being rerouted through Southeast Asia and other countries, but mostly Southeast Asia and India, as well as a reallocation or relocation of Chinese manufacturing capacity. Both of those exercises, both goods rerouting and the reallocation of manufacturing capacity, which is one of the reasons why, as the minister says, FDI inflows to ASEAN have been very robust. The objective of this is to sidestep Chinese tariffs. And if the reciprocal tariffs didn't exist, I'm just trying to explain the world from Washington's point of view. If the reciprocal tariffs didn't exist, then the Trump administration would need to be engaged in a game of kind of tariff whack-a-mole. So, if manufacturing capacity moves to, let's say, Vietnam, our goods are being rerouted through Vietnam, then I've got to increase tariffs on Vietnam, and therefore all of that activity will just be pushed to Cambodia and other countries. So what, in a way, the reciprocal tariffs are trying to do is to kind of cut through all of that, introduce a framework that allows the Trump administration, or gives the Trump administration the capacity to deal with tariff arbitrage, not in one fell swoop, because all of these, this will be a dynamic process, but it gives them a framework to kind of address what they see as the sort of core problem.
And from the perspective, Minister, of Malaysian companies, what do they see the core challenges as being right now? Obviously, as you said, Malaysia's a really globally integrated sort of manufacturing center. You have, biggest trading partner is China, but you have a lot of major US investors in Malaysia making semiconductors and many other electronic products. So you talk to manufacturers, other companies all the time. What are they worried about? Is it the tariff rate that you settle on with the US? Is it sort of US-China tensions? Is it the broader environment? What are the core sort of issues they're coming to you to try and solve right now?
Well, if you look at Malaysia, and when I talk to the companies, obviously I talk to the companies that are exporting to the United States. What are their main concerns? Number one concern will be the uncertainty. You mentioned about that, and they said that it's very hard to plan investment, plan exports, plan everything, right? And therefore, that is the number one concern. Of course, at the same time, they want us to engage the United States because if you look at United States and Malaysia, we have a very strong trade relationship. China is our largest trading partner, but US is our largest export market. So Malaysia the largest export market is the United States, not China. Similarly for investment, the largest investor in Malaysia is the United States, not China. Right? So US is a very important partner to Malaysia. And if you look at the exports to the United States, you mentioned, Ben, semiconductor. Yeah, 60% of our export to the United States is E&E and semiconductor. Right? And out of that 60%, 65% comes from US multinationals based in Malaysia. So therefore, of course, those multinationals that are based in Malaysia are supported by Malaysian companies. The ecosystem being built over the last 60 years enables Malaysian companies to also participate in that supply chain. So they will also be affected. So the Malaysian companies, for example, one multinational, let's say Intel or AMD or any other big multinational, there will usually be 300 to 400 local companies supporting that multinational. So they are, of course, also worried. So when we talk to the United States, we must also understand what are their concerns. And I think one of my fellow panelists talked about their concerns, about their supply chain, because when you talk about tariffs, it's also about talking about trade imbalance, also talking about economic security, right? They want to know, whether the technology that is being exported, the technology that are secure in terms of the rights towards the technology. But so those are the concerns about the companies. They are very uncertain and about the markets, and at the same time, they want us to engage the United States. And given that most of those companies exporting to the United States are American companies, they themselves have offices in Washington, that they also are engaging Washington on this. But the other point that you mentioned correctly just now, I think one of my fellow panelists talked about the fact that we export intermediate goods. So that is true. A lot of the American companies exporting to the US are exporting the semiconductor are basically intermediate goods, where the finished goods are actually produced mainly in the United States. So again, this is important in terms of supply chain resiliency and supply chain security.
And I mean, I think there's a broader question here for countries like Malaysia, and I think many others in the region, that you've thrived by being this bridge between kind of the US as an ultimate source of final demand, also a source of investment and technology, and China as a source of sort of manufacturing capacity and increasingly, to a certain extent, demand as well. But in the good times when relationships between Beijing and Washington were positive, that was a great place to be. But we know that this US-China competition is not just about Trump. It predates Trump, and it obviously continued through the Biden administration, and it's being driven on the Chinese side as well. So how secure do you think countries like Malaysia can feel in the model you have, thinking about not just the next 4 years, but the next 10, 20 years ahead? Do you think you are going to come under pressure to sort of make choices about who you side with economically? And do you think that you'll need a different model that isn't so reliant on both the US and China going forward?
Ben, I think it's a combination of both. We have already understood the concerns of both. In the last 5 years, we have started to diversify to mitigate that risk. We can't eliminate that risk. We can't even eliminate the impact. And you can see that even today, as we mitigate that risk through accessing new markets. That's why we are in the midst of concluding Malaysia-EU FTA. We just concluded Malaysia UAE FTA. We're going to announce the Malaysia GCC FTA next week. And we've seen the total trade between Malaysia and US is around 11%, right? And Malaysia trade with China is about 12%. So both is less than a quarter of our total trade with the rest of the world. And that number is declining, right? Despite the absolute term going up. So it shows that our diversification strategy is working. We also are requested to be members of other blocks, economic blocks. I think you know which blocks we're talking about. We're talking about BRICS. We're also members of 17 FTAs. We signed, 17 FTAs, both bilateral and multilateral, including the CPTP, RCEP, etc. So that is definitely something that we will continue to do and supporting our companies as well to get that market access through our relationship with other countries and other economic blocks. But one must not forget ASEAN itself. I think Malaysia this year chair ASEAN. Even trade within ASEAN is less than 25%. Today, intra-trade within ASEAN member states is around 23%. That shows the opportunity to increase that. So yes, we need to do more with other countries, and we need to do more with our neighbors as well. When we look at other issues regarding trade, definitely there are concerns. One cannot deny the fact that sometimes people assume that Malaysia or Singapore or any third country will have to make a choice between United States and China. But let me say this, in my negotiations with the US, there's never been one case where US said you have to choose, right? But we understand the concern is more on the supply chain and on economic security. So we need to ensure that technology safeguards are in place. Maybe there are issues about supply chain and not ensuring that supply chain is secure, right? Especially in technology or in areas like pharmaceuticals.
Okay. I think we might come back to this question about trade deals, but I wanted to come to you, David, on this and sort of broaden it out a bit to think about how countries have been responding and whether it's enough. So I think the minister mentioned sort of defending the rules-based trading system, but in practice we've seen a lot of countries, including the UK and Malaysia and many others, sort of making their own ways to the White House, trying to cut deals. So on the one hand, they talk about sort of upholding the system. On the other hand, there is a sort of bilateral, almost beggar thy neighbor approach to get your own sort of exemptions from Trump. So do you think countries are doing enough to sort of maintain an open rules-based system? And is that even possible, to be honest, when you have the world's biggest economy sort of checking out of the system?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the answer to your question depends on who can replace the United States as the importer of last resort. You know, the US is just saying, we do not want to be the importer of last resort anymore. Now, maybe they'll fail in implementing that vision. It's quite possible, because at the end of the day, the US trade deficit is not a function of what Trump wants, it's a function of the difference between savings and investment in the United States. Very sort of deep underlying macro phenomena determine the US trade deficit. But let's say Trump is moderately successful in implementing his vision of wanting the US not to be the world's importer of last resort. The question then becomes, who is going to take the place of the United States? And that's a very difficult question to answer. It may be possible to make an optimistic case about Europe, because fiscal policy and monetary policy are both loosening in the Eurozone, and the new German government is committed to spending a lot of money on infrastructure and defense, as many other European governments are. But the problem there is, A, it's not going to happen, we won't see the fruits of that soon, and B, the whole point of this spending is that it should be domestic spending. The whole point is for this new spending not to bleed out to spending on other countries' goods. So I'm not sure there's a very optimistic case coming from Europe in terms of its capacity to take the place of the United States as the world's importer of last resort. Then the other obvious question is about China. Now, I think the Chinese authorities can be having two equally plausible conversations with themselves. On the one hand, they can say, well, you know what we need to do? The Chinese economy is currently being faced with a terribly negative external shock. The right way to respond to a negative external shock is to accelerate the disbursement of additional fiscal stimulus to support the economy, to protect Chinese households from the negative consequences of this external shock. And therefore, one way of thinking about the direction of Chinese policy is that there will be more macroeconomic stimulus, and that could erode China's current account and trade surpluses over time and turn China into the importer of last resort. I think that's extremely unlikely, because I think the other conversation that the Chinese are having with themselves is to start by saying, why do we have a trade surplus in the first place? We have a trade surplus partly because the surplus provides a layer of insulation for the Chinese economy. It provides a kind of insurance against geopolitical risk by kind of keeping the world at a distance from China, by limiting China's dependence on the rest of the world. And if you follow that line of argument, well, from the Chinese point of view, the need for geopolitical insurance has just gone up, not down. And so I think that the chances of China kind of just saying, don't worry, we'll be the world's importer of last resort, I think that's very unlikely indeed. And so the problem is, if the United States really can, if Trump really can implement this vision of wanting to withdraw from the world, it's very difficult to imagine big economic powers stepping up to that plate. And so that I think the global macro consequence of this is a sort of permanent downward shock to global trade growth, a permanent downward shock to global GDP growth.
And what about for China then, Yujie? Presumably it's similar. I mean, what is the alternative to the US as the source of final demand? Because it's all well and good to talk about global south and forming new partnerships with other countries, but how many small developing countries do you have to increase your exports to before you can get to the kind of demand you can tap in the US in one sort of massive unified super wealthy market? So in a sense, sort of Trump's sort of phony war is saying he's going to push tariffs and imagining there's no costs, but Xi Jinping is also pushing this sort of self-reliance. But I don't think he's surely really countenanced the costs of what it would mean if China were ever to be sort of denied access to the US market at scale.
Yeah, I mean, the clear answer is no one really knows. Firstly, even if we're talking about the tariff as where we stand as now between China and the United States, I mean, this is still 34% towards each other. So for any Chinese exporter who want to make a profit, and the tariff have to be below 30%. So because the profit margin is only around between 10 to 20% of that tariff. And that means whatever the Chinese exporter does, and even within this 90 days, there's still going to be a loss making in terms of when they come to demand and supply in that case. But I think secondly, judging from Beijing's end, they don't see this as something of short-term symptom. but they would rather see this longer term of response to the United States. As I said earlier, what China has been doing ever since 2018 is about de-Americanization. So when we're talking about decoupling between China and the United States, actually China already entertained that idea well before then. In a way, try to refocusing on firstly the alternative market, but secondly, that sense of technology self-reliance. I mean, David earlier talking about geopolitical insurance based on trade and export. But really what I've considered so far is the domestic spending, that massive spending on technology self-reliance, on innovation, on domestic innovation, and making the government procurement, in a way, largely focusing on with the domestic manufacturer. And I think that's really the way forward. So in a way, it's a very sad case, really. An open trade system, like a sense of economic globalization that China embraced in the past, and now they have abandoned themselves. So I really don't really see a clear answer whether China can find another alternative to replace United States and EU. But the reality is that the door is shut for China from US and from European Union. As you can see, even after Liberation Day, that China had some hope that could improve its trading relationship with European Union, and that did not happen. The reason why is because of the structural economic challenge between China and EU now, because what China is producing now comes across as in terms of like being compatible towards European Union, and also suddenly become a peer competitor with European companies. So that will also rise in time of certain larger size global south countries, for example, Brazil, that already filing the EV tariffs against China with WTO. So there's a more trade frictions take place, given what China's economic model wants to be. So there's no clear answer.
So, Minister Zafrov, given these kind of challenges for global trade, which, yeah, as we've all discussed, aren't unique to Trump, I mean, does a country like Malaysia need to think about a different model going forward that's maybe less dependent on global trade? If the barriers are going up, around the world, then maybe being this sort of connected global trading manufacturing base isn't going to be the most sustainable model. So is this sort of trend also going to drive a place like Malaysia to rethink your economy in the next few years and think about what you can do differently, not just negotiate better deals, but thinking about a whole different structure that's less dependent on export-led manufacturing?
Well, Ben, for Malaysia, we can't afford to think that way. If you look at the size of our economy, we are not China, we are not US, we're not India even. We are a population of 34 million people. Even if you look at ASEAN as a whole, with 10 ASEAN member states, the entire ASEAN GDP is only $3.8 trillion, right? So there's no way that we can change the model in such a way that we become self-reliant on all major critical needs of Malaysia, right? That's something that I think is not sustainable, and you will, at the end of the day, I believe, and I'm sure my colleagues in ASEAN believe, that we need to support the rule-based multilateral trading system. The principle of multilateralism is here to stay for us, right? And that's why we talk about global south. We talk about other, worst case scenario. Like I said, the world trade with the US is less than 15%. There's still 85% of trade out there. We need to relook. We need to transform what we have today. It's not perfect, but to change and overhaul in such a way that the principles of multilateralism no longer relevant. WTO, there are weaknesses, no doubt about that. So let's look at ways to improve to make sure that WTO continues to be relevant. And I discussed this with the DG of WTO a week ago. I had a meeting with her. We both acknowledged the shortcomings. We've seen what happened in MC13 in Abu Dhabi, and now MC14 in Cameroon, where again, we need to resolve issues. And of course, the dispute settlement mechanism doesn't work with the appellate body being what it is today. But these are things which we need. We need to fix things rather than, destroy what we've achieved so far. I mean, ASEAN is growing today at 4 to 5%, because at the end of the day, because we are living in an area or in a block where there is peace and prosperity, right?
Can I just add, I think I left something unsaid when I was talking earlier, and I think my advice, for what it's worth, to ASEAN and other countries, other developing countries, is that if you want to maintain, if you want to uphold the global rules-based international trading order, then I think it behoves developing countries to try and put some pressure on Beijing to start to put its money where its mouth is. And in order, developing countries need China to import more stuff from developing countries in order to kind of uphold that order, because otherwise it's just kind of words. I mean, in a way, Malaysia's been relatively lucky or skillful, I don't know, over the last few years, in the sense that in 2017, or after 2017, Malaysia's trade deficit with China has increased by as much as its trade surplus has with the United States. So in a way, it's kind of square. But other countries in the region have kind of experienced different things. Vietnam, for example, its trade surplus with the United States has gone up way more than its trade deficit has gone up with China. And so the US has all sorts of reason to be super upset with Vietnam, because it's kind of, leveraging all of this kind of redirection of supply chains. Thailand, on the other hand, has, if you're Vietnam and your trade surplus with the United States goes up by more than your trade deficit with China goes up, then you attract the negative attention of Washington. Thailand, for example, has seen its trade surplus with the US go up by less than its trade deficit with China has gone up. So that's just terrible bad news for the Thai economy. And so you've got different experiences. I mean, I would say Malaysia's kind of had the best experience of this, in the sense that there's a sort of balance there as a result of the fact that the trade deficit with China has gone up by more or less as much as the trade surplus with the US.
Minister Zafar, I want to come back to you on the sort of the ASEAN question, which you mentioned earlier, that interregional trade is around a quarter, but I think it's been at that level for some time. You have an ASEAN summit coming up this weekend. I mean, meaningfully and practically, what can ASEAN do, as a response to what's happening, to try and boost internal trade and to try and support fairer trade or rules-based trade that works in your interest? Practically, as the chair of ASEAN this year, what can Malaysia do and what can ASEAN do?
Yeah. Well, just to pick up on what David talked about on the need for China to import more from countries like ASEAN. One of the things we're doing, in fact, today during our meeting, our ASEAN meeting, economic ministers meeting with our counterpart, Mr. Wang Wentao, who's the Minister of Commerce for China, we all agreed that we will conclude, and in fact, we just concluded at the chief negotiators level, at the working level, on the upgrade of the ASEAN FTA with China. Right, we have today the version 2.0, so it's upgraded to version 3.0. That we hope will increase ASEAN's exports to China. But for intra-trade with ASEAN, what is happening today, I mentioned the GDP size of ASEAN is $3.8 trillion, and we look at the population of ASEAN today, it's close to 680 million people, of which we look at the number of those who are under the age of 30 is 50% of that 680 million people. So it's growing. But if you look at the companies, they are mainly SMEs and micro SMEs. So to encourage them to trade outside their domestic comfort zone, you require support, capacity building, etc. But e-commerce is one area where we feel that it will help for trade to be more inclusive. So we are at the final stage, and we hope by October, when the leaders meet again, we can conclude the Digital Economic Framework Agreement. We call it DEFA, which is first of its kind for our economic bloc, where we will increase the participation of many companies in the intra-trade within ASEAN, where we have the rules, the guidelines, and also the payment system, etc., to encourage more companies to trade. And this, we hope, will increase intra-trade within ASEAN, because many of companies within ASEAN are SMEs and micro SMEs.
I mean, in addition to ASEAN, Malaysia's also in the CPTPP, this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which the US sort of was originally pushing and then belatedly pulled out of. The UK joined as well. I mean, do you think in terms of scaling up these efforts to support the trading system that you should be looking to expand CPTPP or at least deepen cooperation with other big trading blocs like the EU? I know that the Singapore Prime Minister and New Zealand Prime Minister, who are both CPTPP members, recently discussed with the EU ways to coordinate on global trade. So yeah, do you see the potential for doing more, I mean, not just as ASEAN, but as a member of CPTPP, to combine or work together with the EU and other blocs to try and get some scale in these efforts?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, today we discussed that. And as you know, UK is now also a member of CPTPP, and now UK has got an agreement with the EU as well. Not sure what happened to Brexit. But so when we look at, this, like it or not, what's happening today has actually accelerated some of that discussions. EU and CPTPP, ASEAN and CPTPP, because many ASEAN members who are also CPTPP members. Also RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, comprised of ASEAN plus China plus Korea plus Japan, Australia and New Zealand. So how do we increase membership of that? CPTPP itself also increasing membership with many new countries, new applicants, and we just approved one, Costa Rica now, going through the process. So we all are looking at using the current multilateral platform or multilateral agreement that we have on trade, bringing new members in, and at the same time getting blocks, one economic bloc to talk to another economic bloc, and that's happening at a much faster pace than ever before.
That's good to know. I'm going to come to your questions in the room and online in a second, so please, do get thinking here and put your questions online in the Q&A box. I just want to come to you, David, and ask, we've talked a lot about sort of the downsides of the current situation. Are there any winners? I mean, India often sort of paints itself as a winner in this world, as a sort of transactional country that's been quite protectionist and has a huge labor force and big technology sector. They like to think they can win out of sort of US-China tensions and decoupling and tariffs. I mean, do you see India as a winner in the trade tensions right now? And do you see any other winners, either companies or countries or individuals?
If India is to be a winner, it's got a lot of work to do, I think. The manufacturing sector has been declining as a share of the economy for the last 15 years or so. I think back in 2010, manufacturing was 17% of Indian GDP. Now it's 13% of GDP. There's been this utter collapse in foreign direct investment flows into India in the last few years. Back in 2020, net FDI inflows into the Indian economy was about $50 billion. Last year it was less than $10 billion. So there's on the one hand, there is this kind of, very positive Indian story. And there's clear desire on the part of Modi to establish India as a sort of manufacturing hub. And the production-linked incentive scheme was a sort of central part of the effort to kind of support India's aspirations as a manufacturing hub. It just doesn't seem to have worked very well. And now there's an additional headwind because Trump has kind of, noticed that a lot of iPhones are going to be produced out of India and he wants them being produced out of the United States. And so there's a lot of disruption that the US is capable of injecting into all of this. I think India should be able to take advantage of this. The question is, if India wants to be a manufacturing center, whether it can implement policies designed really to attract manufacturing capital to India, which seems to be doubtful at the moment, given this extraordinary and weird decline in foreign direct investment flows into the economy in recent years. But there's also a kind of more fundamental question about whether India should be supporting or sort of focusing on manufacturing as the be-all and end-all of what it takes to lift incomes. Maybe it's services that India should be focusing more on, or maybe it's some kind of more balanced basket of manufacturing and services. Modi does seem to have, in a way very similar to Donald Trump, a kind of manufacturing obsession. There is this sense in which, and ultimately I have to say, this is a point difficult to separate from concerns about national security, national defense, and ultimately about being able to win wars. A number of administration officials expressed the view, you can't win wars if your economy is based on advertising revenue from Google. You can only win wars if you're manufacturing steel and manufactured goods. And I think that helps to explain the Modi obsession with manufacturing. And so, in a way, the more countries like the United States and India obsess about bringing manufacturing into their economies, the more I worry about the state of the world.
Can I just add in that? I mean, based on what we've discovered lately, we co-authored together with my colleague Chichi Pachpai on China-India paper. One thing we examined quite interestingly is India's economic boom, and particularly on the manufacturing, actually largely rely on China. Because India taking the so-called demographic dividend than compared with the Chinese, and that's one thing. Now, secondly, when it comes to manufacturing, and I think the three factors we shall remember in here. First is manpower, and secondly is infrastructure, and thirdly is national resource. Now, China have the three quite right in the last 2 decades or so. And if you look into India, the infrastructure is not to be there. The manpower for sure, but when it comes to national resources, how you devise those national resources at the sectors which at need, and is nowhere to be found.
Yeah,
so I think that's the differences
very
between China and India.
A very important point. Just that, one of the things Modi was good at doing was spending public money on infrastructure.
Yep.
But that seems, under fiscal constraints and other things, that seems to be kind of a sort of diminishing force in the Indian economy. So that in order to be optimistic about the Indian economy, one of the things you need to kind of be able to rely on is the idea that the private sector will take up the slack in capital expenditure that is left by the government, relying less on capex as a source of public spending. And I'm not sure that animal spirits in the Indian economy are sufficiently robust to be confident about private sector capex.
Okay. All right, well, it's now time for your questions. So yeah, please put your hand up if you have one and just tell us who you are, any affiliation, and please make it a question, not a statement. We've got one at the front.
Thank you. My name is Caroline Smith. I'm a student at SOAS. Japan has been a key ally for the United States, and after Trump's tariffs against Japan, what does the future of that allyship look like, and how does that affect the balance of power within Asia?
Do you want to take that, David?
Well, my view, for what it's worth, is that the only way to kind of impose some sort of rational structure on Trump's vision of global order is to consider the idea that he's kind of breathing new life into the Monroe Doctrine, and that what he's aiming for is an international order based on regional spheres of influence. Now, that doesn't make the US administration indifferent to what goes on in the rest of the world. You don't retreat behind your regional, once you're the regional hegemon, and that's, for Trump, that means, that explains his obsession with Greenland and Canada and Panama and all the rest of it. Once you've established yourself as the regional hegemon, international relations theorists like John Mearsheimer argue that that's not enough. What you need to do in addition to establishing yourself as the regional hegemon is to make life difficult for the other regional hegemons, which is why he's sort of pivoting to Moscow to try and prize Russia away from China. And I think that's why, the State Department, for example, has adopted more kind of aggressive rhetorical stance on Taiwan, for example, in terms of the statements on its website. But I think the fact is that it's difficult in my mind to get away from the idea that if Trump is moving towards an international order based on regional spheres of influence, that does kind of pose an existential threat to Japan, to Korea, to Taiwan. And I don't know how to develop that thought further, except to make the point that if I'm right in thinking that there's at least a tilt towards an international order based on regional spheres of influence, that in a way, by definition, that makes the US-Japan, US-Korea, US-Philippines, US-Taiwan relations much more fragile.
And in a way, Yujia, wouldn't that all be sort of in line with Xi Jinping's vision of a sort of Asia for the Asians?
Well, I mean, that's very much in line with his vision. But whether, I think, it's not dependent on himself, but also largely depends on the recipients of those economies, whether they buy into that line. I think what we have so far is we have this enormous, largely size of the economy and is able to producing many things and desperately looking for customers. So I think that's the challenge for Xi Jinping and his cabinet is where to find the next customers. That is, would by and large, bigger than the United States and sustainably have that level of sustainable interest of buying things. And so far, I think that customer is somewhere on the God and nowhere to be found. So, yeah.
And Minister Zafrul, for Malaysia, economically, does a sort of Asia for the Asians model? I mean, I know some of your former leaders in the past, like Mahathir, have talked about this too. Is that appealing for Malaysia, kind of economic spheres of influence, regional development, regional growth rather than global?
I think it has to be both. Mahathir last time looked at the Look East policy, right? And we add China to the Look East policy. But, we're talking about today, in fact, yesterday, our Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, talked about the Global South, right, working together. So it's about countries at a different stage of development, a different stage of growth, working together. I think we discussed this earlier about developing countries as well. So it's about, understanding where everyone stands at that particular cycle of growth. You look at the GDP per capita, you look at GNI per capita, where are we today? And so we all face the same challenges in a way, but at the same time, we also need each other. So to me, it's again, I don't believe in Asia for Asia. We all live on the same planet.
And another question for you, Minister Zafrul, from online, from Francisco Perez Gonzalez, who's asked, in particular, what role is there for the WTO? I mean, you mentioned some of the limitations to the appeals process. So what can the WTO do and its members right now at the moment to support the system in practical terms?
I think, Ben, I need another 2 hours to explain.
We've got about 5 or 6 minutes, but yeah, hopefully quicker than that.
Yes, of course. I'll give you a very brief answer. We have seen, to be fair, America or United States is still a member of WTO, right? That's positive, right? In the dialogue, even APEC that we just had a week ago in Jeju in Korea, United States still a member of APEC, and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer turned up at the meeting. So everyone is still there. That means everyone still believes that WTO or multilateral platform like WTO still has a role to play. It's just like, what is that role and how effective is that role today? And can that role be made relevant to the global architecture or global economic architecture today? So I think if we make it relevant and we get everyone to agree, and I will not name countries here, but United States is not the only country that always have something to say when we discuss about new ideas or new proposals on WTO.
And any thoughts, David, from your perspective on what can be done about the WTO?
Not really. I think it's difficult, I think. This is a slightly depressing point. I depressed myself making this point.
And it's before lunch. Don't make us too depressed.
Lunch. That makes me feel better. That when we talk about the rules-based international order, at the end of the day, it's difficult to talk about that over the last 80 years without talking about the US power that has underwritten the rules-based international order. So when you take US power from underneath the rules-based international order, it's very, very difficult to hold it together. I completely understand the desire of countries in Europe, in Asia, and the rest of the world, in Canada and everywhere, to kind of cobble together some framework to hold it up. But all I'm saying is a kind of descriptive point or an analytical point that it's a very difficult thing to achieve when it's been US power that's been kind of the basis for that order for 80 years. And in a way, for people who want to make the WTO work, to make all the other institutions of the order work, it kind of behoves those countries to bear in mind this kind of the shock to the system that has been created by US withdrawal, and the need to find some way of recreating realpolitik underpinning for the world order, because that's, it's underpinned by realpolitik.
Yeah, I think
ultimately by military power.
That's a really good point. I think there's often this false dichotomy when people talk about the rules-based system and say, was there really a rules-based system, or was it just American hypocrisy? Yeah. But in fact, it was both, like you're saying.
It wasn't called the Washington Consensus for nothing.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a question over here.
Thanks. Arnab Das from Invesco. I wonder, what you're both saying, what everyone's saying actually sounds suspiciously like the US is still the indispensable nation. And so if that's correct, then I'd be interested in your thoughts on an alternative interpretation then that the US is withdrawing and becoming, or maybe becoming, a regional sphere of influence, a Dunroe doctrine kind of thing. And so that would be that 80 years ago, it sort of made sense for the US as a very large, very rich economy and very secure to offer security guarantees to the rest of the world, to much of the rest of the world, and access to its domestic market in exchange for alliances. Now that no longer makes sense because the US is not so much larger. In fact, in terms of manufacturing that wins wars, it's much smaller than China in particular. So actually what's going on is a kind of unilateral rewriting of that grand bargain, and what it consists of is, I'll give you security guarantees, you give me access to your markets, and you give me investment in mine. And that's a deal that you can strike with China, maybe not, but with Japan, probably yes, maybe with Europe, maybe with the Middle East, India, probably not. Or, there's some sort of deal that you can work out with several of these countries, but not China, right? So therefore, that's the world that's on offer now. And if the US is still the indispensable nation, then ultimately other countries are going to sign up to that deal other than China. What do you think of that proposition?
Minister, did you want to come in there?
Well, again, for Malaysia and for ASEAN, we have always stated that no one is indispensable, and therefore we are going to be friends with all. But definitely, US would like it or not. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure what the latest figures are, but I believe it's about 25% of global GDP, United States, right? Around there. I don't know. I think maybe David and Eugene, know better. It's a quarter of GDP. So in that sense, if you look at the size of the US economy, obviously everyone wants to engage the US, right? But at the same time, there will be limits. In democracies like Malaysia and many other countries, we are also answerable to our constituents, right? I will not be sitting here if I agree to everything the United States want. I'll be kicked out in the next general election. And we've seen the impact on elections in 3 countries, right? We've seen the impact in election in Canada, in Australia, even in Singapore, right? So there will be a point where any countries, be it US or China, just like Malaysia or even the UK or EU, we will have to put the interests of our country first, the interests of our people first, right? So there, I think it's not as straightforward as it may seem, Ben.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I think similarly, what has happened in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades or so on US-China is largely based on this whole idea, US providing security across the world and China come in as the commercial player and having that sense of economic statecraft and working under that security architecture. But at the moment, it seems to be that existing security architecture is winning. And China, by no means, with no interest in extended and overstretch itself into the regions and areas which are little known to be the Chinese and Chinese policymakers. So what we have seen so far is a withdrawal of a superpower and another reticent superpower at the same time, and potentially quite dangerous, because that would have left a security vacuum in this world and no one would really want to take care. And I'm not expecting the Chinese will come in sooner or after, for example, given what happened with the Middle East, that China would come in as more active mediator and so on and so forth in order to secure its commercial interest. But I think ultimately, we're going to be facing a multipolar world, and that each of country and picking sectors they prefer to be aligned with, not exactly aligned and totally with one way to another.
I think the minister's had to rush off to another meeting, I believe. But David, I think 30 seconds left for you to answer this
I
question.
think it's a very interesting framework. The thing about the framework that worries me is the US ability to attract manufacturing capital back to the United States. It is extraordinary. The US, I don't know what the phrase is, what the term is for the envy that one has for one's enemy. But clearly, the US wants to turn its trade deficit into a trade surplus. It wants to turn its economy from a consumption-based economy to a production-based economy, from a services economy to a manufacturing economy. In other words, what Trump wants is for the US economy to look a bit like China. Right. The problem though, is that the toolkit, he wants what China's got, but he doesn't want to use the toolkit that China relied on to get there. In other words, he rejects the idea of subsidies in the process of dismantling the IRA and the Chips and Science Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, because he thinks that tariffs and deregulation and tax cuts and a weaker dollar are going to be a sufficient set of tools to bring manufacturing capital back to the United States. A, I think it's just nonsense. And B, even if it was the case, even if he could use this toolkit to attract capital, manufacturing capital back to the States, it's not going to support US jobs. The US manufacturing wage is $60,000 a year. The Chinese manufacturing wage is $15,000 a year. And in spite of the fact that China's manufacturing wage is a quarter of the US, China has, let's say, 35% of global manufacturing, but it has more than 50% of the world's industrial robots. So even with a manufacturing wage at $15,000 a year, China's commitment to automation is very, very strong. And so the idea that even if the US was successful in bringing factories back to the US, that would actually support US employment, I think is just nuts.
Thanks. Well, America wants to be China, but China doesn't want to be America. But anyway, we're out of time, I'm afraid.
So what's going on the other side?
So we can continue that conversation later, but please join me in giving a round of applause to all our great panelists today. Thanks. And thank you, Minister, for joining us. I know you've got ahead of it.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, David.